What's up, everyone? It's another episode of Wind Down Wednesday. I'm Will. Joining me, as always, Aisha. And we have a special guest today, Dr. Ava Greenwell, Northwestern University professor, a filmmaker, an author. Her latest book, Ladies Leading, The Black Women Who Control TV News. Did I get that right?
You got it right, Will. I taught you well, right?
Exactly. So
Accuracy is important.
That is extremely important. So we're going to talk about her book, her work at Northwestern, and also her podcast, which I had a chance to listen to today, which was really good. But first, we just want to just see how your week was going. How's it been? Aisha, let's start with you.
Oh, it's been a little busy. We're doing contract negotiations at WBBM, so you know how that goes. So it's been like a lot of stuff with that, and it's Hump Day Wednesday, so I'm grateful for that. Just want to get through tomorrow because my days off are Friday and Saturday, so I'm just holding on until then.
So this is more than your hump day then, right?
Right, this is my Thursday.
Okay, more than your hump day. Okay.
Yes.
So this week has been it's been fine. It's been very busy. Look, I can't even remember what day is today. Today is Wednesday, right?
Wednesday.
You know, it's like being back in the newsroom. You know how you would look up and you go, now what day is today? When did I do that story? It was only 2 days ago, or was it 2 months ago? So I'm sort of feeling that way. The students are doing relatively well. We don't have too many COVID cases, which is great. And we are back in the classroom with masks. And so far, so good.
So no one's remote anymore?
There might be some people who are hybrid, but for the most part, everybody's back. And I think the students are loving that because this really gives them, especially those, for example, who are sophomores and had their entire freshman year, for the most part, be virtual. And they're finding that they're more tired because now they have to walk across campus, but they're also more invigorated because they feel as though being in the classroom is much better in terms of retention of information and just listening to lectures. You know, when they are virtual, they can check email. Of course, they can still do that in the class too, but it's just easier for their attention to be diverted to something else when they are virtual as opposed to being in class.
And then you can develop a relationship with your classmates, develop a relationship with your professors, and that's something that you can't do really virtually in the same way.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I know there has been a lot of excitement that Insecure is back. Aisha is a fan. I'm a fan. I saw the premiere of the final season on, I believe it was Sunday. Aisha, you still haven't seen it. And are you just sad though that it is the final season?
I am. It's interesting. So, I think it's been 2 years since the last season. I don't think Insecure aired during the bulk of the pandemic, but I am, and it's something that one of my sisters and I, we were talking about Issa's journey, and how we all feel inspired because we watched her with Awkward Black Girl, and watched other web series and things that she's done, and then to get which many creators look as the big one, this contract with HBO, and to have Insecure air and for it to be a beloved show by many. We just love her journey. I've had the chance to work with Issa when I was working for Comcast Xfinity, and really cool. She got my humor, and I appreciate that. But we're just very, very proud of her success and she just representing herself, being herself, and just doing it.
So she's a lady leading in her own space then.
Yes, she is.
Absolutely. I'd love to get her on my podcast. So if you have some connections, let's make that happen.
You know what, because you did mention yesterday, I caught you during our NABJ Chicago's author series, and you mentioned how you are focusing your podcast beyond just journalism, women working in media, because, we all, regardless of the industries that we work in, have these different struggles, especially when we're the only Black woman, only woman of color in the room or at the board table, in the boardroom or at the table. So that may happen, Dr.
All right.
Dr.
Okay.
Greenwell.
All right. Very good. Very good. Yeah. I think what's really important to note is that unfortunately for Black women and other women of color, and also for Black men, there is this sense that while so much has improved, there's still lots of improvement to be done.
Yeah.
And I think one of my goals with the podcast is really to lift up Black women and to show that there are lots of them doing great things. And I hope that it's educational, but most importantly, inspirational, so that people leave there saying, wow, there are lots of these women who, they're not in the spotlight necessarily, but they're still making strides in their particular fields. And I start with people I know. In journalism, I wasn't able to do that. So I started with some relatives, some nieces who are doing great things. One who's a city councilwoman in Louisville, Kentucky, and worked on Breonna's Law. And then I also chose her sister, who works in mergers and acquisitions. She has a high-ranking position at Yum Foods, also in Louisville, Kentucky. So it's just been very uplifting for me too, to be able to talk to people who I always wondered, what is that job you actually are doing? So I get a chance to be nosy and listen in, but also I get a chance to uplift them. So it's very gratifying.
And the podcast is called Ladies Leading. Initially, it was supposed to be 5 episodes, and now it has expanded. I enjoyed the conversation with your nieces, and it's just interesting to hear 2 women, 2 relatives from different experiences, like sharing their journey. It was a very organic conversation, because oftentimes you look at people and you wonder, how did they get there? And it was very good that in the podcast episode that your nieces shared what it took to get there, and their own insecurities in their career, and trying to overcome and wondering where they were going to go, were they going to make it. So it was very interesting. What was it like for you, just talking with some of your family members who probably have been inspired by you?
Well, that's the part, often we don't tell each other what we're really thinking. In fact, I don't get a chance to see them that often because they do live in a different city. And I think typically when you're at family events, you're there for such a short period of time that you don't really have the opportunity to have those deeper conversations. And so it was so, I knew that the niece, Jessica, who's a city councilwoman, had these experiences. But I had never had a chance to get the details of those things. Same thing with her sister, Jennifer. We know, oh yeah, you work as a lawyer, you went to law school. I remember visiting her when she was in law school in New York, and, just the amount of work, that it takes to have those positions, but also to have them also try to find satisfying lives beyond just the work that they do. So it was just really great to be able to talk to them. And I look forward to talking to more, not only just relatives, but people I know, because again, being a former journalist, we're always taught, don't interview people people you're close to. And so this podcast really gave me the opportunity to turn it into something more than just a focus on the book, but to really uplift women in a variety of professions. And so again, very gratifying for that.
What have you learned during this process, talking to women?
So I think the thing that I learned is that I am very fulfilled when I have these conversations. And so it doesn't seem like work. And that's the thing we all want, right? Is to do work that doesn't feel like work. And so I think it also reminds me of, just editing, for example. You got to stay abreast of all the latest editing tools, and you want to try to streamline your process and make it as easy as possible for you. So I've learned that, but I've also learned that it keeps me fresh, with my students, and making sure that I understand what it's like to have to meet a deadline, even though it may be a self-imposed deadline. And that took place also working on the documentary Mandela in Chicago. Is, you got all these different parts, and how are you going to pull all this material together and make it so that it actually comes out to be something that's coherent, that people understand. And so I think the benefit of being a producer of content, the owner of content, cannot be understated, especially the owner part, because I get to decide. I get to have some control instead of someone else controlling me all the time. And that's what I've learned is really, really valuable.
You mentioned something. I do want to come back to ownership. later on, but I do want to address something that you mentioned about having that balance. We have gratifying and satisfying lives. How were some of the women that you interviewed, how were they able to find that balance? Because a lot of us struggle with it. I'll be the first to admit I could do a lot better when it comes to self-care and even things I know that work. Like deep breathing works very well, belly breathing works well. I had to be reminded of it to do it because you get caught up in the day-to-day. So what are some of the things that were shared with you as far as having that great harmony?
Well, one of the things that I wanted to make sure that I did is that with each episode, have some similar questions so we can actually do some comparisons. So I do like that aspect of the lightning round and what it is they do to de-stress. And so some of the answers range from playing with their children, because that actually helps them de-stress, to a bubble bath with a glass of wine on the side of the tub, to just shutting off their electronics for the day and watching a show that they enjoy. So I don't think it has to be anything that's complicated. I think it just has to be something that's complementary to a person's lifestyle and what it is that they find relaxing. And so I think the key, though, is to actually do it. We always talk about, oh, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do self-care. And then things happen and we get busy. And I'm just as guilty as anyone else out there of, sort of burning the midnight oil, because if there's something I really want, I want to get it done so that I can really enjoy that time. And so I think that's the motivation for me is, okay, I might have a period of time where I know I'm going to be working some extra hours or maybe taking some weekend time to do some work, but I know that's not going to last always. I'm also looking forward to that time where I can relax a little bit. Right. And it is important, though. It is so important to relax and balance that life. Okay.
And ownership, and being your own boss, because, that's very exciting for me.
Yes.
But how do you, but you are, you're a professor, you were my professor, you were Will's professor. You're
my favorite professor.
What'd you say?
My favorite professor.
I mean, really, I tell people I only have one Black undergrad professor, an undergrad female who I need to reach out to, who very good. But you, I appreciate you. And you're no nonsense. You don't play. But I appreciate you. But I appreciate you being also there, for other things. And that's important. Your work, your stuff, and just also, having that humanity, that humane part too. So thank you for that.
Oh, but, you're welcome.
How do you balance, having a full-time job, having a family, and still, being an entrepreneur? Because that's a lot of, time and commitment. How do you, find that, find enough time to do everything, properly?
So you don't find enough time to do everything properly. And as a matter of fact, I really espouse this idea of doing these things in phases. So one of the reasons that I came to the Academy was after working as an on-air reporter for almost a decade. I had my first child and I realized, I don't want to be out there, working 12-hour days. I really want to have some time for this daughter. And then subsequently, 2 other children came behind her, another daughter and a son. And I realized that I did not want somebody else raising my children. I didn't, no shade to the people who have nannies and all those things, because they have to have some help. But I wanted to be the one to be there for them at those special things. So I took a job that specifically gave me more flexibility, and that meaning I could have my summers off if I chose to have those summers off. And I have not looked back and I have not regretted that, because I used to tell my kids, listen, I'm the camp director this summer. This is what we're going to do. We've got our calendar here. We're going to go to the Museum of Science and Industry, and then we're going to go to the Children's Museum this day, all the free days, right? We take advantage of those.
Right.
And so my kids now say, they're adults now. The youngest, the baby, actually will be turning 23 this coming Saturday, as a matter of fact. And so I really spent a lot of time, I think, with them when they were younger, particularly during those times when they had, because I knew that as soon as they turned 13, they wouldn't want to be bothered with me.
Right.
So I
Right.
felt like it was important for that phase. And I've been really lucky and blessed to be able to do that, because I know that there are a lot of women and men who are fathers who cannot necessarily do that. They've got to work when they've got to work, and they've got to, take advantage of the work when it's there. And so I feel really blessed to have been able to do that. But as those children began to be older and not need me as much and not want me as much around, then I started doing some things that, I wanted to do. Like I went back to school and got a PhD in African American Studies. And so I thought it would be a good model, that I would be a good model for them, because when my son at the time, I think he was in 5th grade when I decided to go back to school. And I remember he'd be at football practice and I'd be in the parking lot reading the books that I needed to read for that particular class. And so to me, it was showing them that you never stop learning,
Mhm.
that there's always something new that you can engage in. And so I did that. And then as they got into college and really started to become adults, I wanted to turn that dissertation into a book. And then this documentary kind of landed in my lap. And I really didn't anticipate having to do 2 projects at the same time. But the good thing is, my children were older by then and they could take care of themselves more. And so that's really what I mean by phases, is that sometimes we have to do these things in phases. And so now I feel like I'm in that phase of, okay, I have 3 adult children. They're on their own, sort of. Now I can do more of the things that I've really wanted to do. And so again, great satisfaction when you can take on some projects that you've always wanted to do. And who knows what might be down the line, 2 years, 3 years from now. I also got a coaching certificate during I was going to say, COVID and the pandemic also in some ways gave me more time, because you couldn't go anywhere on the weekends for the most part. So those weekends I spent editing that book, working with the editors on the documentary. And so my husband was also, we were both at home at the same time. And so he was helpful in, helping me proofread all kinds of things. And so I think as horrible as the pandemic has been, there has been some benefit to being at home, right, and not having so many places to go to distract you and take away your time. So phases, that's the way to go.
And I laughed when you said wanted summers off, because my father used to say that. My mom was a retired educator, and he would say, well, if you taught, at least you get the summers off, because, especially working as a journalist, you'd be lucky maybe to get holidays off.
Right.
Maybe, because I've worked the last few holidays, major holidays. So I just chuckled hearing you say that, because it reminded me of my dad.
Let's talk about the book, Ladies Leading, the Black Women Who Control TV News. You say in the introduction that you were watching the coverage of the George Floyd and how news stations were going to frame the 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Talk about that time in our history, which wasn't that long ago, and your thoughts about how this was going to get covered and who was making the decisions on coverage.
So one of the reasons I really wanted to look at this group in the newsroom is because for the most part, they have been invisible. I mean, people who work behind the scenes, just in general, this, Will, right? People see you on television and they think, oh, Will does everything. But what they don't know is, as hard as you work, there are also people behind the scenes working hard. And what they also don't understand is that it's the people behind the scenes who actually are making the decisions, right, about how the station is going to be perceived, who we're going to hire, how much time they're going to get on the air, when their vacations will be. All of those things a manager behind the scenes is deciding. And I had worked in TV news in front of the camera, and I had not seen that many Black women who were actually running the show. And then also when I came to Northwestern, I managed an internship program at that time called Teaching Television. And so I would go to these stations and I would meet with these news directors in small markets and talk about the students' progress. And I noticed that I was meeting with more white women, but I still was not seeing that many Black women. So I always had this desire to, number one, talk to more of them. Again, I'm nosy, right? I wanted to talk to them and figure out, how is it that you've decided to do this? What are your challenges? And so when I had this opportunity to write this dissertation, I knew early on, this is the group that I wanted to work with. I wanted to study this group. And so the book is really about 40 of those women and some of the patterns that emerged in terms of their experience in the newsroom. And that is not only their experience being supervisors and bosses, but also the disruptions that they made in newsrooms and trying to balance and trying to be more fair in terms of coverage. And so when I was writing that introduction, just thinking about all the major stories over the last decade, from Hurricane Katrina to Trayvon Martin, and now George Floyd, just wondering, okay, how many Black women are making a decision on how long this video is going to, at that time it was 8 minutes and 46 seconds. I think we learned later it was actually 9 minutes. It was actually a little longer than that. And so I wanted to open the chapter with that, or the book with that, because I felt as though most people, when they think of who's running the show, they aren't thinking about Black women necessarily running the show. And so I also wanted to disrupt this narrative. Most of the research, the scholarly research that's out there about Black people and news focuses on Black people as subjects of the news, not as shapers and creators and gatekeepers of the news. So that's what makes this study different and what makes the book unique, I believe.
And what challenges did you find that these Black women face trying to transform how news is covered in their respective markets?
So there's so many microaggressions that they experience. One of them is the assumption that they were incompetent until they proved otherwise, whereas many of their white male colleagues were assumed to be competent unless they proved otherwise. And so that difference is a huge difference. It means they walk in with people not being quite sure, them having to prove themselves a little bit more. And I think those kinds of microaggressions meant that they had to deal with those before they could even deal with the work, the job. And the job is stressful enough, as we know. No matter what color you are, what gender you are, running a newsroom, especially a television newsroom, it is hard work. And if you have to layer on top of that microaggressions that you're experiencing, even though you are the boss, and some of the women experience not just microaggressions, but macro assaults, especially early on in their career. I'm talking about, the late 70s, early 80s, when Black women first got into these roles. One woman said she had a white male anchor say, "I don't like taking orders from a Black woman, period," just straight up. Others would curse them out, use the N-word behind their backs, not realizing, oh, this person is here. And so I think those kinds of macro and micro aggressions showed up pretty regularly for the women. And I would say too, one of the areas that I talk about is I call it intellectual theft syndrome. And the reason is because so many of these women, because they're in these meetings and they're leading these news meetings, the morning meeting and the afternoon meeting. And oftentimes they would be overlooked in terms of their ideas. They throw an idea out, and then somebody else who was higher ranking, usually a white male, would throw out the same idea, and all of a sudden it's brilliant. So the women kept using this phrase, "I just said that, I just said that." And so I said, okay, I can't call it "I just said that." So we're going to call this intellectual theft syndrome, because it's a pattern of stealing, taking somebody else's ideas without giving that person credit. And I know that Black women are not the only ones who experience that. Black men experience that. Other women of color experience it. Other men of color experience it. And white women experience it as well.
And it happens in other industries, as we mentioned earlier. It happens across, not just the diverse diversity within the media industry, but people who are, work in publishing or work in education or, whatever have you, transportation. I've spoken with women who have, Black women who've experienced the same thing. And I love intellectual theft syndrome. You have to copyright that, Dr. Greenwell. Copyright that.
All right, I'm glad you said that. See,
That's
why I need all kinds of people on my team.
Yes, no, but seriously, that is something that happens. It's infuriating. I think as a younger journalist, when I was younger, as a cub reporter, how do you combat that, especially when you're the only person of color, not just Black woman, but the only person of color, in a staff meeting, or when you're the youngest reporter that's there? How do you combat that? Because, you have other things that are going through your head as well, as far as lack of, maybe not being as experienced or whatever have you. So copyright that, because, it's
So
unfortunate.
nobody else will steal it, right?
Right. And sadly, it's a real experience for a lot of us,
Yeah. Well, I think some of the women chose to let it go. So, you have to pick your battles. Some of them chose to pull the person aside after the meeting and say, I don't know if you realize, but, this is the third time you've done blank, blank, blank.
Yeah.
Some of the women, they might have given them a verbal flogging right then and there in the meeting. And so it really just depends on your stature in the organization, and the kind of relationship that you have with the people at the station or the people in those meetings. And so it's a tough decision to make. And sometimes the women would walk away, being disappointed in themselves that they didn't speak up or that they didn't say anything at that particular moment. But sometimes they were strategic in not speaking up at that particular moment and not saying anything, because they knew that could be detrimental to their careers, not just at that station, but at future employment as well. Because, it's a small world, right? It's a small business. Everybody knows everybody. And so you do have to be careful when you decide to, make those kinds of decisions, because you never know how it might help or hurt you later on.
I have one quick question, follow-up question to that. So you mentioned, were they flogging the person who stole the idea? What about the individuals who did not even acknowledge them? For that person who that's, whether superior or other person, who you voice your opinion and, you voiced an idea, and then that other individual ignored you. But when, Jim said it, then they gave Jim credit. So do you also pull that other person aside too and say, hey, I don't know if you're aware of this, but this has happened XYZ amount of times, and X, Y, and Z. How do you also do that too?
Yeah. And so I'm glad you asked that question, Aisha, because obviously initially it's the person who stole the idea that they typically would actually pull aside. But to your point, you have bystanders in the room, right, who are not speaking up and not saying anything. And they know that, oh, so-and-so had that idea first. And if more of them would chime in, then whoever's actually taking the idea and appropriate it as their own would probably be less likely to do that. So to your point, I think it is important for all of us who happen to be bystanders in situations like that, when we hear that, maybe to speak up and say, oh, that's a great idea. So-and-so just said that a few minutes ago, and that was fantastic. So that you deflect, but also point out and make clear, what should be clear, but what often is hidden and shadowed.
So where are we now in terms of Black women leading? I know ABC has a Black woman leading, MSNBC has a Black woman leading. So are we making progress?
Yes, absolutely. I think we're making progress. One of the stories that one of the women told me toward the end of the book is, it's time for me to step away. So some of the women did step away because they just got burned out. And so some, stepped away permanently, and others actually got back into it. But one woman said, I feel like if I leave to retire, I'm leaving multiple Black women in management positions, so that when I leave, things won't bottom out and be zero. So I do think, certainly with the ascension of Kimberly Godwin at ABC News and Rashida Jones at MSNBC, we are seeing some of these things happen for the first time. Also, some of the women who I'd interviewed who were in news positions have ascended to general managers at various stations. So that too is an improvement in terms of really reaching even a higher position at television news stations. So I am optimistic, but cautiously optimistic. And the reason I say cautiously optimistic is because when we look at the RTDNA statistics, the annual survey that's done every year, one of the things that we know is that numbers can stagnate or even drop a little bit. From year to year, it's up and down. And so what we really have to do, I think, is look at overall trends over time and not get complacent, because I think that's what we experience probably during the early 2000s, is a little bit of complacency. Part of that had to do with the internet and news organizations really having to figure out, okay, what's this, how are we going to make sure we make money, and how are we going to, do this? We're losing, if you're at a television station, you're losing viewers because now people are going online. So do we stream it to them? So there's still a lot, there are lots of strategies and questions that I think news managers are having to face, because the technology is changing so rapidly that diversity really got put on the back burner. But one of the things I really want to argue in the book is that diversity matters. And here's how it matters. When you put Black women in these management positions, they recognize, for example, missing white woman syndrome. Mm-hmm. So we've just had a whole conversation about, Gabby Petito versus Jelani Day. Right. And the kind of coverage that Gabby Petito got at a national level versus Jelani Day is huge, right? There's a huge disparity. And actually, I'm going to be talking about that with my students for a lecture next week on white supremacy and journalism. And I think that sometimes it's easy to forget that while local stations may do a decent job of covering people of color who go missing, it's the national news organizations that have historically done a very poor job. Why is that important? Because national news straddles across the US. And often when people go missing, they're moving across the US. And it's important for national news to cover, because sometimes we know examples where people have actually been found because of the national coverage. So, but I think back to, for example, the little girls, and I mentioned this last night, Diamond and Tianda Bradley, 3 years old, 10 years old, still have not been found. This year was the 20th anniversary of their, I don't want to say anniversary, the 20th observance of them gone missing. Those little girls never got any national coverage that I'm aware of, or if they did, it was very minimal. I would hope that today that would be different, because now we have more people in places who could speak up on their behalf. But again, I think that hope is not solid. It's not secure, because I know that things can change on a dime.
That is true. And when you talking about Gabby Petito, reminded me that those same discussions were taking place when Natalie Holloway disappeared. That's something I questioned, if I went missing, who would look for me? I know my employers would look for me because, they need me to show up.
But they need you to work.
They need me to work, but beyond like my immediate family and friends and my employer, who else will really look for me? And it's unfortunate that we're still having those types of conversations now. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think the grandmother of the two girls, I think she was complaining not too long ago about there not being enough coverage, trying to look for those girls, now in 2021.
Absolutely. And obviously, I have to say, just to give some context to it, there's some other reasons too. Often, families of color don't always have access to the media, or they don't know someone who actually they can call and say, oh, I know my friend so-and-so works for channel, blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to give him or her a call. Or maybe they're not familiar with how you access the media. But more importantly, at the national level, it's really about national news organizations. They pick up stories from local stations. Right. So I think there's more of an issue of a decision that's made a decision to highlight. Right. And also, when we talk about missing white women syndrome, we're really talking about the tendencies are young, attractive, white women. Right. So if you are an older white woman, if you are an unattractive woman, then that factors in, it seems, as well, when you look at the research and look at the people who actually have gotten, lots of coverage. And, we're not saying don't cover those people. We're just saying you've got to balance it more so that you are reflecting the population of the United States or the population of the city that you serve.
Right. And that goes, those decisions also goes back to your book, your book as far as the topics. And when you have Black women or just diverse people in the newsroom, whether it's reporters and of course as decision makers, then they can kind of push some of those, they can stress the urgency and the importance of certain topics like, hey, you know, these girls are missing, this needs to be a national story, you should really look at this, and you know, those, that sort of thing. So we need that diversity, you know, not just as reporters, but also in decision-making positions.
We're running out
Absolutely.
of time. So I want to get Aisha, you're going to share some NABJ announcements with us before we wrap up.
Yes, give me 1 second. So we have, so NABJ has another podcast that is coming Mondays. We're launching November 1st. So beginning Monday, November 1st.
Yeah, I think Monday's the
That's
first.
right. Mhm.
Yeah, is that the first? Oh, you're
It
right.
is.
What I think the 31st was on. For weeks, I've been thinking that the 31st was on Monday, but starting Monday, November 1st, we are going to have a new podcast led by Victoria Williams, an NABJ Chicago member, and it's called Leader of the New School. So you definitely want to check that out. I believe it's going to be the first Mondays of the month. So you can check them out the first Monday of the month, and the last Wednesday of the month, check us out on Wind Down Wednesday.
And also we want to mention too that anyone who wants to donate to the NABJ Chicago Scholarship Fund, that's always open for donation.
Yes.
Last year we gave thousands and thousands of dollars worth of scholarships out to deserving students in our area. So it's very, very important. I used to head the scholarship committee. Dr. Ava Greenwell, Northwestern professor, publisher, author. You do wear so many different hats. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. And anybody who wants to learn more, get the book, pull it up, Aisha.
Yes, thank you so much to my former student, Will and Aisha. You're doing great work. I'm so proud of you. Keep it up.
All right.
And you can go to ladiesleading.net for the book, or you can go to mandelainchicago.com to see more about the documentary, or you can just Google WTTW because that's where it aired earlier this year.
It was fantastic.
And you can actually watch the film there. So feel free to still go back and watch.
And your podcast.
Yes, and the podcast. Also, wherever you find your podcast, you can find Ladies Leading.
All right, everyone have a good Wednesday night.
You.
Thank you for your time. Good rest of your week and enjoy your weekend. It's Halloween coming up.
Yay!
I'm not dressing as anything. I don't think. I'm not going to a Halloween party.
I will answer the door this year and keep the light on and have some candy for the kitties. That's what I promise to do that. I will do that this year.
Keep the light on.
Right.
That's good enough. Have a good evening, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, Dr. Greenwell.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.